What's up, y'all? Welcome back to the Mining Pod. For today's show, we have Jaran Mellerud, the CEO of Hashlabs Mining, on to discuss Bitcoin mining in the Nordics. Jarran is based in Norway and has a deep understanding of the Bitcoin mining industries in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Iceland. So for today's show, we talk about the Bitcoin mining industries there, which players are most active, which countries he thinks are primed for the most growth going forward, and also a few other interesting tidbits like heat reuse for district water heating in Finland, and also rumblings of a Bitcoin mining ban in Norway that Jarran is somewhat skeptical will actually come to fruition. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Jarran is a longtime friend, and I think he brings some really good insights for Bitcoin mining in this region. So without further ado, let's jump right into it.
Are you a retail or institutional investor interested in Bitcoin mining companies? The Miner Mag brings you free data and analysis from all major NASDAQ-listed Bitcoin mining operations to know who stands out. Check out visualized metrics and data-dependent stories at theminermag.com. Thanks for listening to The Mining Pod. Want more? Subscribe to our main feed on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcasts for another weekly show on Bitcoin stocks. And check out our newsletter at miningpod.blockspace.media today.
Jaran Mellerud, welcome to the Mining Pod, sir. How you doing?
Thank you. I'm doing very good. And thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, man. Happy to have you on. Long time coming. I think you're going to offer some pretty good perspectives on a part of the mining industry, or at least a geography that's not talked about as much, but pretty important in terms of hash rate distribution and really the hub of mining in Europe and some of these Nordic countries. Before we dive into it, can you just give a quick intro of yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Jaran Mellerud from Hashlabs. I live in Norway. We do Bitcoin mining in Norway, Finland, Ethiopia, and Indonesia. So I'm responsible for our operations in the Nordic countries.
And also formerly of Luxor, that's where we got to know each other. Jarran wrote a lot of fantastic articles on Bitcoin mining around the world. He also did some BD stuff while he was over there. And we'll be referencing some of those articles in the course of this podcast, specifically the ones that deal with Bitcoin mining in Iceland, Finland, Norway, and Sweden. So to set the stage, Jarran, can you give our listeners some context as to why Europe's hash rate, and when I say Europe, I'm not referring to Russia specifically, because Russia has quite a lot of hash rate, but specifically Western Europe. Why these Nordic countries, i.e. Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Iceland, why we've seen hash rate concentrate there on the European continent?
Yeah, so to understand that, we have to go back a few years before the energy crisis. And before the energy crisis started in around 2021, there was a substantial mining industry in continental Europe, like countries like Netherlands, Belgium, also Eastern Europe had a substantial Bitcoin mining industry. And in that time, there was not a concentration in the Nordics. Then the energy crisis hit, and continental Europe saw energy prices soar. These soaring prices didn't get into the Nordic countries because the grids of the Nordic countries is relatively isolated from mainland Europe. So, for example, in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and of course Iceland, these are very isolated electricity markets. And let's look at Norway, for example. Norway is divided into 5 electricity price zones, almost like Texas is divided into these load zones. And only the southernmost zone saw prices surge during the energy crisis. So that meant that miners basically moved up north to the northern parts of Norway, where electricity is still extremely cheap, and the northern parts of Sweden. Finland still has very cheap electricity, and Iceland as well. So basically, Europe's Bitcoin mining industry was forced as far north as possible to avoid these very high prices that you see in continental Europe.
And part of that is because, like you said, some of these electricity markets in these Nordic countries are dislocated from the continent, like particularly like in northern Norway and northern Sweden. But it's also because they have a high density of things like hydro and nuclear, right? Like Norway has an outstanding
penetration of hydro. It's like 99% of the electricity they all generate, right? In Sweden, something similar. I think it's 50 or so. And then they also have like 30% nuclear. This is based on the Bitcoin Mining Around the World series that you wrote for Hashrate Index, which I highly recommend anyone listening. If you want to learn more granular details about the Bitcoin mining industry in these countries, I recommend you read that article. Some of the data and the information will be a little bit outdated. It was a few years ago, but we'll refresh it as we go along on this podcast. On that note, if you could go country by country, maybe starting with Norway and then going Sweden, Finland, and Iceland, what has changed the most in each of these countries since you wrote that article series with regards to the Bitcoin mining industry and maybe some regulations that are targeting it?
Yeah, so I wrote this article series around, I think it was around 1.5, 2 years ago. And to be honest, not much has changed. And Norway has seen a growth in the hash rate. Sweden has seen a substantial decline in its hash rate, while Finland is the newcomer and has seen a very large increase and will probably be the biggest Bitcoin mining hub in Europe over the next few years. Iceland, not much has changed there. Many miners are transitioning to AI. We can start with Iceland. So Iceland doesn't really have a big surplus of electricity anymore. And it is an island after all, and they can't really import electricity from anyone. And historically, Iceland has had a very large electricity surplus. So this electricity they have historically used on aluminum smelting, and since like 2015, 2016, growing Bitcoin mining industry. And this Bitcoin mining industry grew up to a point around 2022, where it grew to basically use almost all the excess electricity in Iceland. So there is not a lot of room to grow there. And Iceland also have a very good connectivity with internet cables, etc. And is a very prime location for AI data centers. So a lot of these miners are naturally transitioning to AI in Iceland. Then we can move to Norway. Not so much has changed in Norway during the last 2 years. Only thing that has changed is that there is substantially more Bitcoin mining capacity in Norway. I estimate around 300 to 350 megawatts is operating in Norway right now. Almost all of it is operating in the northern part due to the cheap electricity in the northern part. So let's, for example, the average spot price in the northern price zone in Norway in 2024 was 2.4 cents per kilowatt hour.
Wow.
So you have a very, very cheap power up there. And this naturally attracts the growing mining industry. Power is getting kind of scarce in Norway as well, since the industry is growing so much. But I still see substantial room to grow there. Also, what is changing in Norway is just the government is getting trying to impose a little bit tighter regulations on the mining industry. So we can look a little bit back, and around 2017, the Norwegian government, they understood that they had a very large power surplus, and they didn't know what to do with it. So historically, Norway was a big hub for aluminum smelting and other electricity-intensive industries, but most of them moved away from Norway in the 2000s to China and other countries like that, where labor is cheaper. It's the same which has happened in the US and other Western countries. So Norway sat on all this excess electricity that they didn't know where to put, and the government in 2017 devised a national data center strategy, and they wanted to attract data centers to Norway in that time. They wanted to attract Facebook and Google, but instead they got only Bitcoin miners. And of course, they were not so happy with that when they understood that they had attracted a lot of miners. So they started from around 2019, 2020, they started getting a bit more unhappy with the mining industry and trying to impose some stricter regulations. So up until 2023, miners in Norway were eligible for a very, very low power tax, basically zero. And at that time, the government basically put the miners in a different tax bracket, which increased their power tax to, is around 1.3 cents per kilowatt hour in Norway power tax. Let's say you have 2.4%, 2.4 cent spot price of electricity, and then you add this 1.3 cent of power tax, then you're already at like 3.7 cents, and then grid fees come on top of that in some regions. So this power tax has a substantially negative impact on the mining industry, but it's still very profitable to operate in Norway. And some miners manage to avoid this power tax by reusing the heat, but this is not possible in large scale.
So if you reuse the heat, you're considered that you have like an industrial application, and so that you can use that other tax rate. Is that?
Yeah, you can, if you register your company like as some heat producer, you can achieve a lower tax rate. But this is not really scalable, because let's say that you have a 100 megawatt data center. Who is going to use 100 megawatt of heat?
Yeah,
it's very difficult to deliver. But if you have, let's say, 2-3 megawatts, then you can find someone to purchase that heat from you.
Yeah, and especially difficult for those miners in the north, I would imagine, too, or they're in pretty sparsely populated areas, right? And that's where most of the cheap energy is. But anyway.
Yeah. I even heard about some, like I met some miner from Norway who has like 100 megawatts. They actually considering to build like a 100 megawatt greenhouse just to use 100 megawatt heat.
Amazing. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to derail. Continue.
Yeah, Sweden. So Sweden had, I think, the largest Bitcoin mining industry in Europe until like 2022 or something. Sweden has a very large power surplus in the north, and primarily by hydropower. Like the grids of Norway and Sweden in the north, they're very well connected between Norway and Sweden. But from north to south, there is a huge constraint due to mountains, basically. So all this stranded power in Norway and Sweden is kind of the same power grid, I would say. And they had a power tax increase. So the Swedish tax authorities did the same as the Norwegian tax authorities. They put the miners in a different tax brackets. But the problem in Sweden is that the tax bracket there, like the normal power tax, is like 3 cents per kilowatt hour and not 1.3 like in Norway. So Swedish miners saw a huge increase in their costs due to that tax. And this has basically decimated the Swedish Bitcoin mining industry, and it's not so much left. I would say it's around 100 megawatt in Sweden. It could have been much more if it wasn't for this tax. Some Swedish miners managed to stay operational because they're very highly advanced with demand response and heat reuse. So Sweden and Norway, they have a very similar demand response system like in Texas. So miners can substantially reduce cost by curtailing a certain amount of time. And this allows some miners in Sweden to continue to operate. In Finland, what has changed during the last couple of years is just the industry is starting to really grow there. I think 2 years ago, there was not much mining there. Now I think there is around 50 to 100 megawatts, and it's growing substantially. The unique feature about Finland is that they have a hugely developed district heating system. So in each city in Finland, you have a district heating plant or several district heating plants. And they burn either biomass, coal, natural gas, and deliver heat in the form of hot water to huge buildings around in the city.
Huh.
And Bitcoin mining can actually be used to heat these district heating systems and deliver the heat. So in Finland, you have the potential to integrate mining into this energy system in a very beneficial way. And that's why I see a huge potential in Finland. And we are also doing that. We have a site in Finland which is integrated with the district heating system. And that site is like 1.5 megawatt. It's a small site, and it's heating the base, basically the base heat demand during the summer. So let's say that in the summer, the heat demand is 1.5 megawatt of that city, and in the winter it might be like 8 or 9 or 10 megawatts. So you can use mining to heat the base load of the heat, basically. And this can be integrated in so many places in Finland. I know also Marathon has a project like that, very similar to the one Hashlabs has. And so yeah, that's what's happening in Finland.
Today's show is brought to you by Digital Shovel. Digital Shovel is a leading manufacturer of modular mining pods as well as PDUs and switchgears. Unlike many other competitors, their product is designed and manufactured in North America with a complete UL inspection on the entire unit, not just individual components. Additionally, Digital Shovel is one of the most vertically integrated manufacturers of over 75,000 square feet of sheet metal shop, SMT and wave solder PCB assembly, as well as final assembly all under one roof in Toronto, Canada. Their price point leads the industry when compared to products with rates as low as $69,000 per megawatt for a complete data center with smart PDUs and switchgears. To learn more, visit digitalshovel.com.
So for the Hashlabs deployment, are y'all using immersion or air cool for the heating?
We are using hydro cooling. There is
okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, there is currently there is only the Watts miners hydro-cooled models that are able to generate enough heat to be integrated into the district heating systems. You can use immersion as well, but I haven't heard anyone who had very good success with that. I think hydro is definitely the way to go. And the thing is, the higher heat you can deliver, the better. The more, most of the district heating sites, they require that you deliver more than 70 or 80 degrees water. And there is only like the Watts miner hydropool that can deliver that right now. Yeah, so if my hope is that there will be some manufacturers, perhaps Watts miner, perhaps someone else, who can make hydro-cooled machines that can deliver even warmer water, like up to 80 or 90 degrees, because that would unlock a whole new, so many new district heating plants that can be heated by mining.
So how did this partnership come about? So you're working directly with the municipal water authority or whoever in Finland, I would assume, for this.
Yeah.
How did this deal get brokered, and what's the structure? Is it like, is there a revenue split? Is it a hosting agreement? How did this whole thing come about?
Yeah, so after I wrote this article for Hashrate Index, actually I got contacted by some guys in Finland who wanted to do it. So, and we started working together, and basically we are selling the heat to the district heating system. And in the beginning, it was very difficult to like convince district heating plants to do this, but now actually they are starting to come to us because they talk with different district heating plants, and they all understand that like mining is the best way for them to reduce costs and reduce reliance on imports from Russia. And the funny thing here is that the EU is actually the EU is very anti-mining on the outside, but they are actually incentivizing mining right now in Europe, because the EU is disincentivizing the district heating plants from using Russian biomass and natural gas for heating. So there is a lot of these district heating plants in Finland now who basically are forced to stop using these Russian energy products for heating, and the only way they can stop doing that is by replacing that with electrical heating, and mining is the best way to do electrical heating. So the EU is ironically incentivizing mining in Europe.
That's interesting. And so these rigs, the hydro setups, are basically hosted at the facilities, like these district heating facilities, right?
Yeah, you have a different district heating facility, like the one we are at. We have a container right next to that facility, and hot water is delivered in a pipe under the ground, basically, like 20 meter into the district heating plant.
Interesting. And this is probably especially viable in Finland because of that new nuclear power plant, I would assume.
Exactly.
Okay, because the electricity that's I don't know, what is it? Is it a gigawatt power plant? How much or is it?
Finland has like 4.4 gigawatts of nuclear power, and this reactor they started in 2023 is I think the third largest in the world. So yeah, Finland has gone from, this is also why Finland is such a like booming country in mining suddenly, is because they went from having an electricity deficit to suddenly having a quite large electricity surplus after this nuclear power plant opened. And they're also building a lot of wind power along the coast. So Finland is the fourth country in the world by share of nuclear generation at 42%.
Really?
Yeah.
And it's like what? 15 million people? How big is Finland? Is it even that big?
Oh, it's like
5.5 million. That is crazy. That's wild. Wait, so they've got the fourth largest nuclear generation capacity.
In percentage of total generation.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah. Mining is a way for Finland to basically electrify their district heating system, or at least portions of it. And it's perfect since they have so much nuclear. So you can replace all this Russian biomass and the natural gas with nuclear through mining.
So two questions. What you said, the EU is incentivizing this, they are pushing people towards, electrical heating for these water utilities, or for these hot water utilities. What are you seeing this in any other countries, like specifically Bitcoin mining application for this? And the second question is this a very common form of delivering hot water to European consumers? Because this is crazy to me, because in America, most people have boilers in their house, right? But are these district heating apparatuses like very common?
So to answer your first question, in Europe, I think there is only in Finland that this will really, really take off in the next few years. And then perhaps over time in some of Eastern European countries, because Finland has the most developed district heating system in the world. Basically, I don't know the percentage, but most of their heat is delivered by district heating. Let's say in Norway, where I'm from, it's completely different. We are mostly electrical heating. So we have all these panel ovens everywhere. And the district heating is starting to be bigger in Norway as well. Finland also has quite a large district heating market, but the Finnish district heating companies, they're not in a hurry to switch from this biomass and to electrical heating like in Finland, because, they're not really importing it from Russia.
Yeah, they're just cutting down trees in northern Norway or something like that.
Yeah, probably.
And then, the second part of that question, this is kind of off the topic of mining, but is district heating very popular in Europe? Is that in parts of the EU, is that a normal way that people would consume their hot water?
Yeah, it's if you divide Europe in two, like one eastern part, one western part, in the whole eastern part, district heating is quite popular. And I don't know, but I think it's some Soviet Union.
I was about to say, it seems like a relic of the USSR because it seems wildly inefficient if you really think about it. But this is not a waters and utilities and electricity. Well, it's partly electricity podcast, but it's not a utilities podcast. So I won't bore our listeners with that. But hopping back to Norway really quickly, you had mentioned before we started recording that Norway is kind of in the process of trying to ban or at least severely restrict Bitcoin mining. Can you go into that for us?
Yeah. So I explained earlier in the podcast the history of mining in Norway, and when the government understood that they suddenly didn't like mining in like something around 2020, they tried to do all these different things to get rid of the industry, but they haven't been successful so far. The only thing they have managed to do is to put the miners in a different tax bracket so that they pay a little bit higher taxes. But I think this was in 2022. The government actually they investigated how they could ban mining. And this was a coalition led by a party called the Red Party, which is a very socialist party in Norway, the most socialist party you can find in Norway, actually. They, of course, failed, and this ban didn't really pass the judges. And now they're trying again. So they're just investigating ways they can basically put spokes in the wheel for this industry. And I don't think, definitely it's not going to end with a ban, but I think they might continue to find small ways to make life more difficult for miners. But the nice thing about Norway is that since it's such a stable country, even if the government doesn't like what you're doing, it's really hard for the government to stop you from doing it. The government also have to follow all the rules and regulations, and they can't just change the rules like this, like they can in some other countries. So because of this, I would say that even if the government doesn't like mining in Norway, mining is still a very good, Norway is still a very good country for mining.
So yeah, that was going to be my next question is, do you think that these bans will actually come to fruition, or are there enough? Okay, so there are enough legal protections and also property rights in Norway for this to not be a problem. Like they can tax the hell out of it to a certain extent, but they won't be able to outright go, China mode and say you can't do this anymore.
Yeah, they can do like that. And one of the reasons is also because it's hard to legally segregate mining from other data center industries. So when they wanted to target miners to give them a higher electricity tax, they had to basically increase the electricity tax for the whole data center industry. So of course that made all the other data centers very angry, and yeah, so that's also why it will be very hard for them to get anything negative done to this industry.
In the competitive world of Bitcoin mining, one name stands out: CleanSpark, America's Bitcoin miner. At CleanSpark, efficiency isn't just a goal, it's our standard. Our sophisticated facilities are built and led by expert teams who care about Bitcoin and the communities we work in. Scale, we've mastered it. Our large-scale operations have set us apart in the industry as examples of community-oriented building. Our track record speaks for itself. We navigate the complexities of the new economy with precision and with skill, continuously achieving operational milestones. Curious about how we do it? We invite you to discover the story behind CleanSpark's success at cleanspark.com.
Speaking of data centers, I want to hop back to Iceland for a second. And you mentioned that Iceland is courting a lot of HPC and AI players. I mean, I know, I believe it's Bitdigital is, I think, trying to retrofit a data center there for HPC, or is it Hive? It's one of the two. But that aside, actually, it's not Bitdigital. I think it's Hive that's trying to do that. What is the rationale behind that? Like, why is it that these HPC and AI data centers are coming there, or Iceland's trying to court them?
It's mainly due to Iceland having... So first of all, Iceland is an island in the middle of nowhere. and this gives it very high security. So even if there is like a big world war, Iceland will probably be a very safe place to be. It's also they have some subsea cables for internet, so the connectivity and redundancy there is also very, very good. And there is a cold climate, so this whole package is fantastic for AI. And you can't find that package in, let's say, northern Norway, because in northern Norway there is from what I've heard, there is not enough connectivity and redundancy for AI. So there is very few AI companies that want to be in northern Norway, but there is a lot who want to be in Iceland. So you will easily find customers there compared to in northern Norway.
So you think that's going to be a trend that's maybe isolated for Iceland? Like, you think that'll be probably, out of the 4 countries we've touched on today, might be the front runner for these HPC and AI data centers going forward?
Yeah, I think so. And I think over time, probably the connectivity and redundancy will be better in northern Norway, and northern Sweden. So maybe we'll see more of these AI data centers there as well in the future, but that's like a long, long way in the future.
I want to zoom in for a second on the actors in the region, specifically what types of companies we see active. I mean, a lot of public companies, right? We've got Bitdeer in Norway with something like, I think, 110 megawatts of capacity. You've got Digital in Iceland, Hive in Iceland. You said that I think some of these companies were also active in Sweden for some time. I think Hive, perhaps, but that's becoming. You said the mining industry in Sweden's kind of becoming diminished as a result of those high prices. Northern Data was pretty active in Norway for a while. That was actually the first Bitcoin mine I ever toured. Pretty crazy experience. It was in northern Norway in the fjords, and it was in this old Olivon mine, and you would go down these tunnels, and it was frigid, but then you had these containers of S9s humming away. That was in like 2018. But would you say that the landscape is weighted towards public companies operating in this region, or would you say there's also a lot of private mining going on?
I would say there is mostly private miners mining happening in Norway and Sweden and Iceland, like Nordics. So from my estimation, there is around 170 megawatts of public miners operating in the Nordics. And in total, it should be around 500 megawatts of total capacity. So that's like, I don't know, 25% or something. Yeah. So that's similar to actually the share of hash rates on the total globe by the public miners.
Right. And it seems like a lot of the Bitdeer seems to have the largest deployments out of some of those public miners. It's like Hive and Digital have like little, like 5 to 10 megawatt slices.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you know why that is?
Yeah, so Bitdeer, they're heavily investing in Norway. Like they bought a large site in Norway, I think about 1 year ago. And this site, they're expanding heavily. So Bitdeer is expanding towards 489 megawatts. I checked it yesterday. So they will be huge in Norway. So right now, as I said, around 350 megawatt of mining in Norway. Once Bitdeer is finished with their expansion this year, later, they will have 489 megawatts. So that's more than all the other miners in Norway combined. I think they view Norway as a great place to operate outside of the US. They have a lot of capacity in the US because Norway, cold climate, relatively cheap electricity, safety. Maybe it will be a potential in the future to retrofit these sites to AI, which could be extremely profitable for them. Yeah, and it's also one point I wanted to mention is that I think the Nordics is one of the best places in the world for public miners, they want to go outside of the US and Canada. Like you can't really find any other region and that is better because it's very safe and like geopolitically stable, relatively politically stable, and it's cheap electricity here. The electricity markets is very similar to those you find in the US with potential for demand response, etc. So I think it's a very good place for public miners.
Yeah, very few places with the operational temperature that you would like the Nordics, the political stability and general societal safety, and just also having pretty competitive power rates. So you said about half a gigawatt, right? 500 megawatts active in these Nordic countries. Do you have a breakdown by country of how much hash rate you estimate is active in each?
I don't have a breakdown of hash rate, but power, let's say 300 in Norway, 100 in Sweden, and 50 in Finland, and 50 in Iceland, something right around that.
Okay, wow. So Norway is still clearly in the lead. Do you think it will maintain that lead?
Yes, it will, especially now when Bitdeer is expanding so heavily in Norway. Like Norway will increase so much. But over time, maybe Finland will take over because there is gigawatts of potential deployments on this district heating side.
Okay, so perhaps in the future, we might be looking at Norway, Finland, and then a tie between Sweden and Iceland. It seems like there's two things going on there. It's Iceland just doesn't have that much room to grow. I suppose they could build more geothermal, but there's only so much electrical capacity you can create on that island unless you're going to develop natural gas or coal or nuclear or something, right?
Yeah, and also I spoke with some miners in Iceland, and they told me that there is enough natural resources to develop more geothermal and also more hydro, but the population there is very against building out more electricity generation because they want to preserve their nature. So very unlikely that we will see substantial increase in Iceland. And this also applies to Norway. We're not seeing any increase in the generation capacity in Norway at all.
Because they don't want to build any more hydro dams lest you screw up the fjords or something.
Yeah, exactly.
That's interesting. But a lot of the dams in Norway, or at least the one that I remember going to, the actual hydro facility was pretty interesting because it was like built into the mountainside, or it was like they diverted the water into it for the turbine. Are most of them like that?
Yes, most of them are like in a pipe, and that allows them to direct the water much faster. And also, some of them can also pump the water back up into the reservoirs, so the reservoirs act as a battery. So that's how we designed this system. So Norway's hydropower system was built like by my grandfather's generation. Basically, they just after the war they just wanted to build as much hydro as they could, and now unfortunately this build out has stopped. So
yeah, the pioneering spirit has subsided, it seems. Looking outside of the Nordics, are there any countries in the EU or Europe, Western Europe, Central Europe, and Eastern Europe, excluding Russia, because we already know about what's going on there? They've got a lot of mining. Are there any other countries in Europe that have promising Bitcoin mining futures or have prominent amounts of hash rate currently in their borders?
I don't think there are any other countries in Europe with substantial mining activity than the Nordic countries right now. And there was some activities in Eastern Europe as well as some Western European countries before the energy crisis, but that is mostly decimated. Ukraine had a lot of potential. They have so much hydropower in Eastern Ukraine, also a lot of coal, and this huge nuclear power plant, the biggest in Europe, in Zaporizhia, which is now controlled by Russia, basically. So yeah, I don't think there is so much potential outside of the Nordics. Maybe if you can integrate mining into the like demand response markets, you can make it happen in Europe, because there is such a huge development of wind and solar in Europe, almost like we have seen in Texas, that there will be a very large need for demand response. And I read yesterday some Norwegian energy magazine, and they wrote that by, I think it was 2029, they estimate that 20% of all the hours will be priced below 0.1 cent per kilowatt hour in Central Europe. So very large volatility, a lot of negatively priced hours. So if you are a miner and can turn on and off your machine based on the energy price, then maybe you can make it happen in Europe.
But never the large industrial scale sites that we see in other hotspots like Norway or Finland or things like that.
Probably not. But I also wanted to mention an interesting fact from northern Norway, northern Sweden, is that, and this I think is the real reason why the government has been so aggressively against mining in these countries. It is because Europe basically had a vision of implementing all these new green industries. So these are industries that would support the green transition in Europe. Battery factories, hydrogen plants, green steel. And the government of Europe subsidized these industries heavily and decided to place them in northern Norway, northern Sweden. But now they're all falling like dominoes. So after interest rates increased, the support of this green transition subsided. These companies are not they're going out of business. And they were supposed to use an enormous amount of power in the northern parts of the Nordics. So with these companies out of the electricity, like the queue for getting electricity, there might be a lot of electricity to take for miners in the future in the Nordics. And I can't really see any competitor for this electricity in the Nordics to miners, because already in the beginning of 2000s, aluminum factories, all these historical industries, they moved out. And traditional data centers, they also can't really be there because there is not enough redundancy, etc. All these green industries that were heavily subsidized, even they went bankrupt. So what do you have left to use that or that power? You have only miners.
You only have the ocean boilers and the energy sponges.
Exactly.
No, that's an interesting anecdote because it highlights how many factors are at play for miners. You know, people often think of they just find where the energy is and they go and plug in. But there are all of these political and economic factors in the background that are informing their futures or taking it away from them, right? Well, Jarran, any final thoughts before we hop off?
Yeah, I can just say that the Nordics is a very interesting region for mining. If you listen to the show and you want to learn more about mining in the Nordics, feel free to contact me. You can contact me on Twitter at Jaran Mellerud. And Colin, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely, man. This was awesome. Really appreciate it.